Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we will go deep into the dark mountains of Georgia, where the quiet forests keep secrets that time has tried to hide. Please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from if you are joining us from anywhere in the world. Let's get started. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. There is no connection between this story and any real people, living or dead. In 1905, the Appalachian Mountains in Georgia looked like the end of civilization. Dirt roads wound their way through deep valleys and between giant pine trees, linking small, isolated communities that lived much like they did hundreds of years ago. The northern part of the state, close to the border with North Carolina, was known for its wild beauty and for something darker. There were stories that people didn't want to tell out loud in the misty hills and icy streams. At that time, Robin County was a big area with few people living there. There were only a few villages on the map, and they were separated by kilometers of thick forest. The families who lived there had to hunt, fish, and farm on a small scale to stay alive. There weren't police stations on every corner, paved roads, or electric lights to light up the nights. When the sun went down behind the mountains, it was completely dark. The Holloway brothers made a name for themselves in this place. Nobody knew for sure when they got to the area. Some people said they were from Tennessee. Some people even said they were from the mountains themselves. Everyone agreed that there was something very wrong with that family. They lived on a private piece of land that few people dared to go to because it was surrounded by thick trees and steep rocks. Reports about them started quietly. People who traveled along the main road said they saw smoke rising from that direction at odd times of the night. Some people said they heard sounds coming from the woods, like muffled cries that echoed through the valleys. People learned not to ask too many questions back then, though. To stay alive, they had to keep their heads down and stay out of other people's business. The Holloway property was on a natural rise and was safe from both sides by ravines. To get there, you had to follow a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. Anyone who was brave enough to climb up would find a dark wooden cabin with small windows and a porch full of old tools. There were makeshift fences and what looked like an empty barn around it. Everything there gave off a feeling of neglect and decay. People knew that the brothers didn't talk much. They went to the closest village to buy supplies and made quick deals without looking anyone in the eye. They wore old clothes, hats with wide brims that hid their faces, and carried old rifles slung over their shoulders. People watched them from a distance and talked about them, but they never talked to them directly. That fall, though, things changed. A merchant who owned a small store in the village started to see a troubling pattern. In the last few months, a number of travelers who passed through the area had just vanished. They were people who were passing through and didn't know the area well. They were driving along the mountain roads looking for work or a new start. No one told anyone they were missing because no one was looking for them. The merchant kept a notebook to write down the names of people who bought supplies for long trips. He looked over his notes and saw that at least 7 people had talked about following the trail that went by the Holloway property. No one saw them again. He told other people in the neighborhood what he thought, but they were all too scared to say anything. Everyone knew that looking into the Holloways could be risky. The official laws didn't mean much in the Appalachian Mountains. The closest police officer lived days away on horseback and didn't often go on the remote trails. The people in the community took care of their own problems, and when things got out of hand, silence was the most common response. But this time, the quiet was starting to get too heavy. The Georgia mountains got hit hard by the winter of 1906. The snow covered the paths and made the landscape look like a white, quiet sea. Families stayed even more isolated during these months, saving food and firewood to make it through until spring. It was a time when even the strongest people stayed away from long trips. But it was at this time that doubts about the Holloway brothers began to take on a more real shape. Last fall, an itinerant pastor named Thomas Garrett came through the area and preached to small groups of people in the valleys. People knew him for being kind and always helping those in need. Garrett wrote to a sister who lived in South Carolina on a regular basis. The letters came every 2 weeks on time, thanks to the limited postal service of the time. The sister started sending telegrams to the post offices in nearby villages when the letters stopped coming. She wanted to know where her brother was. A farmer who saw Thomas Garrett alive last saw him on the main road, carrying his old Bible in a small leather bag. The pastor said that a small community high in the mountains had asked him to lead a service. He said he would be taking a second trail that went through the woods. The farmer remembered this detail well because he had warned people about how dangerous that route was, especially with winter coming. Garrett thanked him for his concern but kept going, sure that his faith would keep him safe. There was no news for weeks. The pastor's sister finally went to Georgia, determined to get answers. She got to Rabun County in early 1906 with pictures of her brother and a long list of the last places he had been. It was during this desperate search that she first heard about the Holloway brothers and the rumors going around about their land. At first, the people who lived there were hesitant to give out information. They talked in low voices and looked over their shoulders as if they were afraid of being heard. But the grieving woman kept going, and that finally broke down some walls. An old hunter who knew every trail on that mountain said that the pastor's route went right through the Holloway property. He also admitted that he had found personal items left behind in the forest near that area months before. An empty leather wallet, a torn hat, and pieces of fabric stuck in bushes. Garrett's sister went to see the sheriff of the county next door, William Bradshaw. He had technical authority over that area, but he didn't go there very often. Bradshaw had been in the military before and was a skilled officer. But he didn't want to look into the Holloways either. He knew the stories, knew their reputation, and knew that going on that property without proof could lead to a fight. But the pressure was getting worse. There was more than just the missing pastor. More names started to show up. A traveling salesman who sold tools and household goods hadn't come back from his route in almost a year. 2 brothers looking for work in the sawmills up the mountain never made it there. A widow who was going to see distant relatives just disappeared along the way. They had all been through the same area. They had all said they would follow the trail close to the Holloway property. The store owner, whose notes first made people suspicious, chose to do something. He got a small group of trustworthy men, all of whom were armed, and suggested that they all go to the property together. They wouldn't directly blame anyone. Instead, they would ask questions, look around, and try to figure out what was really going on in those remote areas. Sheriff Bradshaw agreed to go with the group because he felt like he had to. They left on a cold morning in February. 6 men on strong horses followed the muddy trail that wound its way up the mountain. The fog was so thick that you could only see a few meters ahead. The only sounds in the forest were the animals' heavy breathing and the sound of hooves hitting rocks. As they got closer to the property, the group started to feel more and more uneasy. The cabin looked like a ghostly figure coming out of the trees. There was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant that someone was home. The windows stayed closed, and the ripped curtains made it impossible to see inside. There were rusty farming tools, metal chains, and wooden stakes that had been driven into the ground in a haphazard way all around it. Everything there looked like it was falling apart, as if time had forgotten about it. But at the same time, it was still lived in. First, Sheriff Bradshaw got off his horse, and then the others did. He walked to the porch, where the boards creaked under his feet, and knocked on the dark wooden door. There was no answer right away. He knocked again, this time loudly saying that he was in charge. After a long time of silence, the door slowly opened to show one of the Holloway brothers. The man was tall and thin, with a messy beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to watch every move the visitors made. His clothes were dirty and had stains on them that couldn't be identified. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the group with a look that showed both distrust and what could be seen as contempt. The sheriff told them why he was there, talked about the missing people, and asked if they had seen anything strange in the last few months. The answer was short. No, they hadn't seen anyone. Yes, they lived alone. No, they had no information to share. Brother Holloway stood in front of the entrance to make it clear that he wouldn't let them in. Behind him, in the dim light, another figure moved. It was probably the second brother, who was just as quiet and threatening. The sheriff tried to insist, but a quick gesture stopped him. The man at the door reached for the rifle that was leaning against the wall inside. This was not a direct threat, but a reminder that they were armed and ready to protect their territory. You could feel the tension in the air. The men who were with Bradshaw instinctively reached for their own guns, but the sheriff told them to stay calm. The group decided to back off at that point because they knew that fighting right then and there would be dangerous and could even lead to death. But before he left, the sheriff looked around very carefully. He saw that the ground near the barn had been disturbed recently, as if something had been buried there. He also saw pieces of fabric and leather hanging from a side fence that looked like they had been part of clothing or bags. And the smell stood out to him the most, an unpleasant smell coming from somewhere on the property that he couldn't quite place, but that made him very uneasy. There was a lot of silence on the way back. Each of the men rode in a single file, lost in their own disturbing thoughts. Sheriff Bradshaw knew that the visit had only confirmed his suspicions, but it hadn't given him any solid proof that he needed to take stronger action. Back then, the law said that searches of private property could only happen if there was clear evidence of a crime. The Holloways, on the other hand, had not committed any visible crime. When they got back to the village, word of the failed trip spread quickly. Pastor Garrett's sister was worried about getting answers, but all she got were blank stares and vague words. The sheriff said he would keep looking into it, but everyone felt like they couldn't do anything. The rough terrain, the distance from cities, and the fact that the community was so far away from other people made it impossible for official justice to get there. That's when something unexpected happened that changed everything. In the early spring of 1906, a young man named Daniel Crawford stumbled down the main street of the village, bruised and clearly scared. His clothes were ripped, his feet were bleeding from walking barefoot on the rocky paths, and his eyes were full of fear that words couldn't describe. Daniel was a traveling worker who had come to the area a few weeks before to look for work on local farms. He had agreed to do some temporary work for two men he met on the road. They promised to pay him fairly for helping them fix up a property in the mountains. Daniel, who was naive and needed money, followed them down the trail that everyone knew so well. What he saw on that property would be the most important and disturbing evidence in the whole case. When he finally got to talk to the sheriff and a few trusted residents, Daniel told them things that confirmed everyone's worst fears. He talked about the cabin's interior, which was dark and messy and full of personal items that clearly didn't belong to the brothers. There were suitcases piled in a corner, clothes piled up, Bibles and prayer books, tools of all kinds, and everything was covered in dust and looked like it had been left behind. Daniel said that for the first few days he was treated pretty normally. He did basic maintenance work, fixed fences, and put tools in order. As the days went by, though, he knew that something was very wrong. When they thought he wasn't listening, the brothers talked in low voices, brought up things he couldn't fully understand, and acted more and more hostile and unpredictably. Daniel heard his brothers fighting loudly the night before he ran away. He was able to hear bits of the conversation while he was sleeping in the barn. They were talking about how things were getting complicated, how someone was asking too many questions, and how they needed to fix a problem. At some point, one of the brothers said that Daniel had seen things he shouldn't have and that they needed to decide what to do with him. The boy was terrified. He waited until dawn, when it was very quiet and he knew his brothers were asleep, and then he ran through the woods, using only the faint light of the stars to find his way. He ran through the thick woods for hours, tripping over roots and scraping against branches, all because he wanted to stay alive. When he finally saw the first lights of the village at dawn, he was so tired that he fell down, but he kept crawling until he could get help. Sheriff Bradshaw needed Daniel's testimony exactly. There was now a survivor, someone who had been inside that building and lived to tell the story. There was also mention of material evidence, which are things that could be linked to the missing people. With this information, Bradshaw was finally able to set up a bigger, more organized operation that was legal. But it wouldn't be easy to plan such an operation. The sheriff needed more men, more guns, and a well-thought-out plan. He asked for help from nearby counties by sending them messages. He also needed time to write official warrants that would allow not only the search of the property but also the arrest of the Holloway brothers if any evidence of crimes was found. In 1906, all of this red tape in rural Georgia took weeks. In the meantime, the community was getting more tense. Everyone knew that the Holloways would eventually learn about Daniel's escape and the plans that were still being made. There was a real fear that they would run away into the mountains and never be found, or worse, that they would try to destroy evidence and anything that could get them in trouble. The sheriff kept Daniel safe by hiding him in a private house and keeping an eye on him all the time. The boy was traumatized and often woke up from nightmares, reliving the scary things that had happened to him. But he was determined to help and make sure those men were punished for what they had done. As the weeks of planning went on, more details started to come to light. The old hunter who had talked about finding things left behind in the woods before decided to be more honest. He said that over the years he had seen strange things happen in that area, like animals avoiding certain parts of the woods, plants that looked like they had been disturbed for no reason, and ground that looked like it had been disturbed in a strange way. A trader from a different village also came forward with important information. He remembered selling the Holloway brothers strange amounts of lime and tools like shovels and pickaxes. They always paid with old coins and yellowed notes. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now that he can see the bigger picture, those purchases seem very bad. During this time, Pastor Garrett's sister stayed in the area and refused to leave until she got clear answers about what happened to her brother. She set up vigils, talked to everyone who might have information, and wrote detailed letters to state officials, pushing for official action. Her determination was key in keeping the case in the news and making sure it wasn't forgotten or ignored. By the end of March that year, everything was ready. Sheriff Bradshaw had put together a group of 15 men, some of whom were deputies from nearby counties, and some of whom were trustworthy civilians who had volunteered. Everyone had been told about the risks. Everyone knew how serious the situation was. They would leave the next morning at dawn. This time, they weren't there to ask questions. They were there to search thoroughly and, if necessary, make arrests. The night before the operation was long and full of stress. The men talked about their plans, checked their weapons, and got their supplies ready. Some people went back to their families knowing that they were going into a situation that could be dangerous. It seemed like everyone in the community was holding their breath, waiting for the end of a story that had gone on for way too long. The mountains were covered in a thick fog that made it look like dawn was coming. The 15 men met in the middle of the village as the first rays of sunlight tried to break through the low clouds. Sheriff Bradshaw gave the last orders, stressing the importance of being careful and organized. People shouldn't act on a whim. Nobody should leave the main group. The job was clear. Look into the Holloway property, write down everything they found, and bring the brothers in to answer questions in front of a judge. The ride up the mountain was not like the ones before. This time, everyone felt like they were working toward the same goal, and they were determined to end the cycle of disappearances, both because it was the right thing to do and because they had the legal power to do so. The horses rode in a line. The men kept their weapons ready, but not obviously pointed, showing strength without starting a fight. Some things about the property caught their attention as they got closer. There were signs of recent movement on the trail, like wagon wheel tracks in the mud and human footprints that looked like they were going back and forth in strange patterns. There was also ash in some places, as if small campfires had been lit along the path at night. All of this made it seem like the Holloways knew something was going to happen and might have gotten ready for it. When the cabin finally came out of the trees, there was an eerie silence in the air. The chimney didn't let out any smoke. The windows stayed shut, and nothing moved in the area. The group set themselves up in a way that made it impossible for anyone to get away. Some men stood in front of the property while others stood behind it. This time, Sheriff Bradshaw went back to the porch with 2 deputies. He knocked loudly on the door to show that he was in charge and to show the official search warrant. The seconds felt like hours. He hit again, harder, and his voice echoed through the quiet woods. Nothing, no answer, and no noise from inside. Bradshaw decided to break in after 3 failed attempts. The men pushed the door together, and it opened more easily than they thought it would, as if it weren't locked. As their eyes got used to the low light, they could see more and more of the cabins inside. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears and added layers of unease that no one had expected. There were 3 main rooms in the cabin. Things that had been thrown together in a messy way filled the front room. There were suitcases of different sizes stacked against the walls. Some were open and showed men's and women's clothes, while others were still locked with rusty padlocks. There were a lot of books on the floor, most of which were religious. There were also travel tools, water bottles, hats, boots, and other things that didn't seem to be organized. Things were even worse in the kitchen. There were dirty dishes in the sink, food scraps that were starting to rot, and empty bottles all over the place. But what stood out the most were the personal items neatly arranged on a shelf. Leather wallets with ID cards, small amounts of cash, and old, yellowed photos. The Holloways seemed to have trophies that reminded them of the people they had met. The third room, which was the brothers' bedroom, was locked from the inside. The men also had to break down that door. What they found there was a small, cramped room with 2 straw beds and a lot of other stuff that had been left there. But this room was different in some way. There were notes and scribbles made with charcoal right on the wood, names, dates, and numbers that looked like they were amounts of money. It was a scary record, a sad record of years of crime. The sheriff started to link the names on the walls to the reports of people who were missing. There was Thomas Garrett, the pastor, the traveling salesman, the 2 brothers looking for work, and the traveling widow. All of their names were carved into that creepy wall. And there were others, many others, whose names had not been reported missing because no one was looking for them. While the team looked inside the cabin, other men started looking around the area. The barn had more things in it, like an old cart that looked like it had been used to move heavy things. There were also farm tools, chains, and thick ropes that were all covered in a layer of dirt that made it look like they had been used recently but then left behind. They found the most disturbing thing near the barn. The sheriff's first visit showed him a disturbed area of earth that was actually much bigger than it looked. The men started to dig carefully with shovels. They found things buried just a few inches deep that confirmed their suspicions. Things that had clearly been hidden in a hurry. Pieces that told silent stories of tragedies that had happened there. The search went on for hours. Every new piece of evidence made the pile of evidence bigger. Some of the papers were burned in a nearby bonfire, and some of the clothes were hidden under loose boards. There were also maps with travel routes that went through that area. Everything pointed to a carefully thought-out pattern. Crimes that weren't done on a whim, but after careful thought. But there was a big problem. The Holloway brothers weren't there. The cabin was empty, and their things were gone. There was no sign of where they had gone. It was clear that they had just left, probably the night before or early that morning. They had clearly been warned that the net was closing in when Daniel Crawford escaped just a few days before. Sheriff Bradshaw quickly put together search teams to look through the trails nearby. Some men went north to North Carolina, others went down the valleys to the east, and a third group looked into the deeper mountain passes. But there were so many options. The Appalachians had hundreds of ways to get away, as well as natural caves and hidden valleys where someone could hide for years without being found. The sheriff decided to carefully write down everything they found on the property while the outside searches went on. Every item was listed, every name on the walls was copied, and every detail was written down in official reports. He knew that even if the brothers weren't caught, that evidence was important for making a strong case and giving the victims' families some peace of mind. Pastor Garrett's sister came to the property to look through her brother's things. It hurt, but it had to happen. She knew his Bible, his clothes, and even the hat he wore when he left on that last trip. As she held those things, tears flowed silently. They confirmed what her heart already knew, but her mind couldn't fully understand. Other people who lived there also came forward and named things that belonged to people who had gone missing. Every name on the list of victims made the story even worse by adding another painful detail. The shopkeeper remembered the tools he had sold to the traveling salesman who had gone missing. A woman in her 80s recognized the shawl that had belonged to the widow who was traveling. The Holloway brothers' crimes were shown to be very serious, piece by piece and object by object. The weeks after the discovery changed the mood in that part of the Georgia mountains completely. What had once been a secret rumor in the shadows was now a well-known fact that everyone in the community knew about. In bigger cities, newspapers started writing about the case, calling the Holloway property a place of dark secrets hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. Sheriff Bradshaw set up a small temporary office in the nearest village and turned it into an operations center to coordinate the search for the fugitive brothers and the processing of the evidence that had been collected. Every day, telegrams were sent to officials in nearby states describing the suspects and asking for help in catching them. Posters with detailed descriptions of the brothers were put up in dozens of towns and cities, and people were offered a reward for information that led to their arrest. The investigation showed even more disturbing things about how the brothers ran their business. It was clear from the documents and testimonies that they had come up with a specific way of doing things over the years. They found people who were traveling alone, people who didn't have strong ties to the area, and people who no one would immediately look for. In a place where these kinds of gestures were appreciated, they offered help, temporary work, or just a place to stay. The names carved into the walls of the cabin started to tell their own stories. Investigators found that a lot of the victims were seasonal workers who moved from state to state looking for work. Some were religious missionaries who traveled to remote areas to preach. There were also traveling merchants, people running away from problems in other areas, and even some who were just looking for a new beginning away from their troubled pasts. The fact that the Holloway crimes worked so well was because their victims were only there for a short time. Back then, it was hard and slow to talk to people in other parts of the world, and there weren't many official records. Many people lived nomadic lives without permanent addresses, so when someone went missing, it didn't raise any alarms right away. It could take months for distant families to notice that someone was missing, and when they did, it was almost impossible to find out where they were going in the mountains and valleys. Daniel Crawford, the young man who had gotten away and whose testimony had started the whole official investigation, gave more information as he worked through the trauma he had been through. He remembered bits and pieces of conversations he had heard between the brothers that talked about a system they had perfected over the years. They talked about how geography worked in their favor, and how trails that weren't very busy gave them chances that wouldn't be available in more crowded areas. In the meantime, search teams kept looking through the mountains. The Appalachians in Georgia and nearby areas made a natural maze of valleys, canyons, thick forests, and caves that were hard to find. Some villages were so cut off from the rest of the world that they didn't even show up on official maps. These were communities that didn't have much contact with the outside world. The Holloway brothers knew that area very well, which gave them a big edge over anyone who was chasing them. One of the search parties that went into a very remote valley found signs that someone had recently camped in a cave. There were still warm ashes from the campfire, footprints in the wet ground, and even food scraps that had been left behind in a hurry. Everything pointed to the fact that the fugitives were always on the run and never stayed in one place long enough to be caught. The first real evidence of where the brothers were came in May 1906. A farmer in Tennessee, several days' ride from the original property, said he saw two men who looked like the ones on the posters. They tried to buy things with old coins and yellowed bills, which is how the Holloways usually paid. The men quickly left when the farmer said he was suspicious. They went down a trail that led even deeper into the mountains. This new information led to a new round of searches, this time in Tennessee. Local officials were called to action. In different communities, volunteer groups formed, and the search for the Holloway brothers became one of the biggest search operations ever in that area. But the mountains were huge, and the people who were running away were very good at not getting caught. Scholars and officials kept looking at the evidence at the abandoned property. One thing that really interested the investigators was the money side of things. There were small amounts of money among the cataloged items, but nothing that matched the total amount the victims probably had. The records on the walls showed specific values for each name, which suggested that the brothers kept very close track of what they got. The theory that came out was that the Holloways had built up a lot of wealth over the years, which they probably took with them when they ran away. This would explain how they were able to keep moving and buy food and other supplies even though they didn't have a steady job. It also made people worry that they could live on their own for a long time, which would make it even harder to catch them. Families of the victims started to come together in the area to find out what had happened to their loved ones. Pastor Garrett's sister stayed there, and now other mourners who were also sad were there with her. They worked together to plan vigils and religious services, which brought people together who were all affected by the tragedy. It was a way to deal with grief as a group and find meaning in the horror. The effect on the people who lived there was huge. People who had lived in relative isolation and trust now looked at each other with new caution. The fact that these kinds of crimes had been going on so close by for so long without anyone noticing made people feel vulnerable. People were now locking doors that had been left open before, and they were more suspicious of strangers. A local pastor, unlike the one who had gone missing, started talking about what evil is and how important it is for people to be on the lookout for it. He talked about how the mountains, in all their wild beauty, could also hide deep darkness. His words struck a chord with the people in the church, who now saw the familiar landscape in a new light, aware of the shadows that had once lived there. That year, in June, there was another sighting, this time in North Carolina, in a mountainous area close to the Virginia border. Two men who fit the descriptions had been seen walking down a side road with heavy backpacks. When a wagon driver offered to take them somewhere, they suddenly said no and ran into the woods. The wagon driver, who had read about the case in the news, told the local authorities right away. Once more, teams were sent to that area. But when they got there was no sign of the fugitives. It was as if the Holloway siblings had gained an almost supernatural ability to vanish, moving through the mountains like ghosts, always one step ahead of their pursuers. People in charge of the search became more and more frustrated, but their resolve to catch them never wavered. The summer of 1906 was very hot in the Appalachian Mountains, which made trails into dusty paths and made it even harder to search. Teams had to carry more water, take more breaks, and deal with thick plants that grew quickly in the hot sun. Even though things were hard, the search for the Holloway brothers did not stop. Everyone was determined to bring justice to the victims and their families. During this time, Sheriff Bradshaw started getting letters from all over the United States. Some of the letters were from people who said they had seen the fugitives, while others were from family members of travelers who had gone missing in previous years and were wondering if their loved ones might have run into the Holloways. Every letter was carefully looked into, and every lead was followed, even though most of them led to dead ends. A woman from Kentucky wrote one of the most important letters. She wrote about her husband, a skilled carpenter, who left in 1903 to look for work in the mountains of Georgia and never came back. She thought he had just left the family, which was sadly common in those hard times. But after reading about the Holloway case in the news, something inside her made her question that. The sheriff sent the carpenter's description to be compared to the records that were found in the cabin. Confirmation came weeks later. One of the names on the walls was a perfect match, even down to the details that only his wife would know. The woman went to Georgia, where she found carpentry tools among the listed items. These were tools she had helped her husband buy years before. It was a painful moment of truth that turned doubt into certain grief. People started telling similar stories from different places. A brother looking for news about a sister who had left to work as a governess and then disappeared, and parents looking for news about a son who had promised to write but never did. Every new case that might be linked to the Holloways made their crimes seem bigger, showing that they had left a much bigger trail of criminal activity than anyone had thought. In the mountains, on the other hand, the search took a new turn. Samuel Porter, a skilled hunter who knew every trail and cave in the area, was hired to help find the criminals. Samuel didn't talk much, but he was very skilled. He could read signs in the woods that other people didn't see, figure out what marks meant that had been left days before, and guess where people would go based on how well he knew the area. Samuel had a different idea. Everyone thought the brothers were always on the move to avoid being caught, but he thought they would eventually have to set up a temporary base. It wasn't possible to live on the move forever, especially as summer went on and some areas ran out of natural resources. They would have to stop at some point, even if it was just for a little while, to rest and get more supplies. Following this line of thought, Samuel started to map out remote places where experienced wildlife lovers could easily hide. Deep caves with nearby water sources, secluded valleys with lots of game, and hidden clearings where fire would not be easily seen. He made a list of about 12 places that he thought were good candidates. Each one was days of walking through rough terrain away from the others. The sheriff agreed with Samuel's plan and put together small groups to check each place in order. This method was more focused and methodical than previous searches, which covered large areas in a fairly shallow way. Before any approach, each location was carefully watched for signs of recent occupation without letting potential occupants know. The third place on Samuel's list had some good results. It was a deep cave in a very remote valley that could only be reached by climbing down steep rocks. The observation team noticed thin smoke rising from a crack in the rocks at dawn, when the cold air made any heat visible. Someone was definitely there, and they were trying to keep a fire going without being seen. Sheriff Bradshaw was told right away. He got together a bigger group of men and made careful plans for how they would attack. They couldn't just surround the cave because the rocky ground gave them many ways to get away. The plan was to put men in key places at night and wait for dawn, when visibility would be better and the people in the cave would probably be less alert. The operation started on a night in August when there was no moon. The men walked quietly along the trails, each carrying only what they needed to make as little noise as possible. Samuel Porter was in charge, and even in almost complete darkness, he walked with perfect precision. It took hours to get everyone in the right place, making a secret circle around the cave that no one could see. The tension was thick as the first rays of sunlight hit the mountains. The men stood completely still, guns ready but not aimed, and were on the lookout for any movement or sound. The plan was to wait until the people in the cave came out on their own. At that point, they would have no way to escape or fight for a long time. About an hour after the sun came up, something moved at the cave's entrance. A figure slowly came out and looked around carefully. Even from a distance and through the plants that hid him, it was clear that the man fit the Holloway brothers' descriptions. He was tall, thin, had an unkempt beard, dirty clothes that were torn by time, and lived in very basic conditions. Sheriff Bradshaw stayed put. If there was one man, the other was most likely in the cave too. If you only caught one, the other could get away, which could mean months or years of searching. At that moment, patience was very important. The first man walked a few steps out and stretched his arms and legs. He still didn't seem to know that there were people watching him. A second figure showed up a few minutes later. The two brothers were finally together and weak, far from the safety of the mountains that had kept them safe for months. That was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The sheriff blew a short whistle that echoed off the cliffs, which was the agreed-upon signal. Right away, the men came out of hiding with their rifles pointed and firm voices telling the brothers to give up. It was clear that the Holloways were surprised. For a brief moment, they looked like they were trying to figure out how to get away by quickly looking at the trails around them. But when they realized they were completely surrounded, with at least a dozen guns pointed at them and no way to get away, they seemed to lose all of their will to fight. They slowly raised their hands above their heads, like men who had lost to fate. The sheriff and his deputies moved slowly, keeping their guns trained on the prisoners as they handcuffed them with heavy chains. There was no talking at first. The brothers stayed quiet and looked down, as if they finally understood that their months of running were over. The sheriff noticed a big difference in how they looked since the last time he saw them. They looked like ghosts of their former selves, thin, sunburned, and covered in cuts and scrapes on their arms and faces. It didn't take long to look around the cave. They found evidence of a long-term occupation inside, such as makeshift blankets, the remains of hunted animals, and some of the things they had taken from the original property, like a bag with a lot of money and documents that belonged to several victims. It was the last piece of evidence that linked the brothers to the crimes that had been documented. It took 2 full days to get the prisoners back to the village. The Holloway brothers were handcuffed and walked with armed guards all around them, who took turns watching them all the time. The two hardly spoke at all during the trip, only exchanging glances every now and then, as if they were communicating in some code they had come up with after living alone together for so long. News of the capture spread quickly through the mountains, with messengers on horseback and telegrams sent to bigger cities. When the group finally got to the community where it all started, there was already a big crowd waiting for them. There was no violence or chaos at the reception. Instead, it was a quiet gathering of people who had been living in fear, uncertainty, and pain for a long time. Sheriff Bradshaw put the prisoners in a makeshift but safe cell, with guards always on duty outside. In 1906, the law in that area was basic, and it would take time to set up a formal trial. In the meantime, preliminary interrogations began. These were attempts to get confessions, or at least explanations for the years of documented crimes. The brothers, on the other hand, stayed stubbornly quiet. When asked directly about the victims whose names were written on the walls of their cabin, they just looked down and didn't say anything. When they were shown the things that had been found on their property, they didn't show any emotion. It was as if they had made up their minds that they didn't need to or want to say anything else now that they were caught. Even though there was this annoying silence, the investigation went on. Both the prosecution and the defense had lawyers, but it was hard to find someone to defend the Holloways because of the nature of the accusations and how people felt about them. Finally, a lawyer from a nearby town who believed in due process took the case. He or she knew that even people accused of the worst crimes deserved good representation. The families of the victims kept coming to the area as legal preparations moved forward. Each person had their own story of loss and their own questions that would probably never be fully answered. Pastor Garrett's sister, who had stayed in the area during this time, became a key figure among the grieving, providing comfort and organizing group efforts to remember the people who had died. One thing that hurt a lot was not knowing what had happened to each victim. The Holloway brothers wouldn't talk, and the physical evidence, while there were a lot of things in papers, didn't give any information about what happened. Families had to deal with uncertainty and fill in the blanks with their imaginations, which made the grieving process even harder. The date for the start of the formal trial was finally set in September 1906. The county courthouse, a simple wooden building that didn't often host cases of this size, would be the site. Judges from more developed areas were asked to watch and help with the case because it was too complicated and important for local judges to handle. There was a lot of work to do in the days leading up to the trial. People who saw what happened were put in order. The evidence was organized and ready to be shown, and security was stepped up at both the courthouse and the temporary jail. There was a lot of worry that the emotional tension could lead to mob justice, which Sheriff Bradshaw was determined to stop. Daniel Crawford, the young man who had escaped and whose testimony started the whole investigation, was getting ready to be the key witness. He had been having nightmares and trouble dealing with the trauma he had been through since he escaped. But he was determined to face the Holloway brothers again, this time not as a scared victim, but as a witness who would help make sure that justice was done. People from all over the region and even farther away were interested in the first day of the trial. Journalists from faraway cities traveled to cover the case that had everyone talking. The courtroom was full, with every seat taken and many more people waiting outside for news. The air was thick with sadness, expectation, and a shared need to figure out how these things had gone unnoticed for so long. When the Holloway brothers walked into the courtroom, everyone in the room went quiet. They looked even smaller and weaker than they did in the cave, and their bodies were bent under the weight of chains and consciousness. They sat in the dock and didn't look at the audience. Instead, they kept their eyes on an unknown point ahead. The prosecution started by giving an overview of the case. It talked about how the property was first found, what was inside, the names on the walls, and what people in the area said about people going missing over the years. The details were presented in a way that built a story that painted a grim picture of crimes that happened over a long period of time. The first important witness was Daniel Crawford. At first, his voice shook as he started to talk, but it got stronger as he told his story. He talked about how he met the brothers, how he was taken to the property, what he saw while he was there, and finally, the conversation he overheard that made him run away in the middle of the night. His story was long, consistent, and very emotional. The Holloway brothers didn't show any signs of emotion during Daniel's testimony. They didn't pay attention to him. Their faces stayed the same. They stayed still like statues. Everyone present felt uncomfortable because of this lack of emotion or recognition, as if it confirmed a basic lack of empathy or remorse. There were more testimonies after that. The merchant who kept track of travelers' records showed off his notebook. The hunter talked about the things he had found in the woods that had been left behind. Family members were able to find things that belonged to their missing loved ones. Each witness added to the accusation, giving it more depth and showing how bad the crimes were. The defense didn't have much to work with. They tried to cast doubt on the reliability of some witness statements and argued about technical issues of jurisdiction and procedure, but they couldn't refute the mountain of physical evidence. The defendants themselves didn't offer any other defense or explanation that could lessen the charges. The defense attorney's job was almost impossible because they wouldn't talk. The prosecution showed the physical evidence on the third day of the trial. There was a table full of things that had been taken from the property, and each item was labeled and recorded. There were Bibles with names written in them, wallets with ID cards, clothes, tools, and family photos. It was a quiet but strong display, with everyday things standing in for lives that had been cut short and stories that had not been finished. Pastor Garrett's sister was asked to name the things that belonged to her brother. She walked up to the table slowly, and her hands shook as she touched the Bible, which she knew right away. For a second, it looked like she was going to fall apart, but she kept her cool and said in a strong voice that those things had belonged to Thomas Garrett. When she got back to her seat, tears finally came to her eyes, and many people in the room felt the same way. The trial went on for a whole week. Every day there was new testimony, new proof, and new layers of information about the Holloway brothers' crimes. The whole community kept up with every new piece of information as they all dealt with a tragedy that had affected them in ways they were only beginning to understand. On the 8th day of the trial, something unexpected happened that changed the tone of the whole thing. One of the Holloway brothers said he wanted to talk for the first time since he was caught. The older of the two, whose name was William Holloway in the records, asked the court for permission to speak. The whole room seemed to hold its breath while the judge thought about the request and finally gave it the green light. William got up slowly, and the chains clinked as he moved. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from weeks of silence, but it was surprisingly clear. He didn't give a long confession or ask for forgiveness. Instead, he talked about the mountains and how living in that isolation changed people. He also talked about how deep loneliness could change how people see things until right and wrong became unclear ideas. His words were disturbing, not because they were violent, but because they were cold in a philosophical way. He said that living in the mountains was different from living in civilized society, where different laws applied and survival was based on more basic rules. He didn't name any specific victims. He didn't say he had done any specific crimes, but he talked in vague terms that made it seem okay to live a life that was completely separate from normal morals. The court sat in silence, feeling uneasy. Some people were shocked that William didn't seem sorry for what he said, while others were just confused by how philosophical it was. The judge finally spoke up and asked him directly if he had confessed to the crimes he was accused of. William looked at the judge for a long time before nodding. This was a silent confirmation that carried the weight of all the evidence that had already been shown. James Holloway, the younger brother, didn't say anything even after William spoke. He looked at the floor for a long time, closing his eyes every now and then, as if he wanted to be somewhere else. He didn't say anything about his brother's words, either confirming or denying them. He was just a smaller, weaker presence there. The evidence presentation phase was over with William's confession, even though it was vague and philosophically twisted. The jury, which was made up of 12 men from the area who had been carefully chosen to be as fair as possible, went to a private room to talk about the case. Everyone knew that the verdict was almost certain because of the strong evidence, but the legal process had to follow its proper course. Many people thought the discussions would take longer than they did. The jury came back to the courtroom after only a few hours of talking in private. The jury foreman, a well-known farmer in the area, stood up to read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge would decide the sentence after carefully considering the seriousness of the crimes. The courtroom was filled with quiet murmurs, not of shock at the verdict, but of relief that justice had been officially declared. Some of the victims' families hugged each other, some cried openly, and others just closed their eyes in silent thanks. The Holloway brothers didn't show any emotion after the verdict, just like they hadn't during the trial. The judge said he would come back with the official sentence after thinking about it for 3 days. This time would give him a chance to look at all parts of the case, look at past cases, and decide on a punishment that fit the crime. For these 3 days, the community was on edge, waiting for the official end of a chapter that had been a big part of their lives for a long time. During this time, something amazing happened in the neighborhood. The families of the victims, who were from different areas but were all connected by the tragedy, put together a group memorial. It took place in a clearing close to the church, which was an open space surrounded by trees that let people see the mountains that had kept so many secrets for so long. There were simple wooden crosses with the names of known victims on them for people whose bodies were never found or whose deaths could never be definitely confirmed. The crosses were like markers that showed where people could go to deal with their grief, even though there were no real graves. Pastor Garrett's sister planted wildflowers around the cross that had her brother's name on it. This was a beautiful gesture in the midst of the sadness. The local pastor, who had helped the community get through those hard months, led a service that didn't use language of hate or revenge. Instead, he thought about memories, paid tribute to those who had died, and found the strength to go on. His words recognized the pain without letting it take over completely, and they recognized the darkness without denying the possibility of future light. The mood in the court was different when it met again 3 days later. There was still tension, but it felt like the process was coming to a necessary end. The judge came in with papers that had his carefully thought-out decision on them. He started by talking about the duty of justice and how the law was meant to protect the innocent and punish people who hurt others on purpose. He recognized the case's distinctiveness: offenses perpetrated in extreme seclusion over an extended duration, and the particular susceptibility of the victims selected specifically for their absence of connections that might prompt immediate inquiries. He talked about how these crimes weren't random but planned, showing that the people who did them had thought about them ahead of time and didn't care about the value of human life. The sentence, when it was finally announced, showed how serious the crimes were. At that time, Georgia law allowed the Holloway brothers to get the harshest punishment possible. They would be sent to a state prison, where they would spend the rest of their lives without the chance of getting out on parole. The sentence was meant to punish them and make sure they could never hurt anyone else again. The brothers took the sentence the same way they took the verdict, without showing any emotion, making any protests, or showing any visible reactions. They seemed to have accepted their fate as soon as they were caught, as if the months of running away had worn down all their resistance or hope. They were taken out of the courtroom for the last time, and armed guards took them to begin their sentences. Now that the trial was over, everyone involved had to go through a long process of emotional closure. Sheriff Bradshaw, who had spent months on the case and the capture, finally felt the weight of it all lift from his shoulders. He had done his job by making sure that justice was done within the law, but he knew that it would take a lot longer for the emotional wounds in the community to heal. Daniel Crawford, whose brave escape and testimony were very important to the case, slowly started to put his life back together. He chose to stay in the area and got a job on a nearby farm where his skills were in high demand. People treated him with extra respect because they knew how much he had been through and how brave he had been to testify. The families of the victims started their trips home with the things that had been found and a mix of closure and sadness. Some promised to visit the memorial every year to honor the memory of those they had lost. Others thought they needed to stay away from that place completely because going back there would be too hard on their hearts. The Holloway property was taken down in the end. The cabin was burned in a supervised ceremony, and the ashes were blown away by the mountain winds. People thought that nature would eventually clean up what had been messed up by people, So they left the land alone to go back to its wild state. After the trial, the Georgia mountains changed a lot in the months that followed. The Holloway brothers' case showed that the system for protecting travelers and temporary workers wasn't perfect, so state officials made big changes. New police stations were built in places that didn't have any police before, and checkpoints were set up on major travel routes so that people could register their movements. Sheriff Bradshaw received official recognition for his work on the case, but he himself admitted in private conversations that the real change needed went beyond individual arrests. He began working with other officers in the region to create a more efficient communication network between counties, a system where disappearances reported in one area would be immediately shared with neighboring jurisdictions. The local community also underwent internal transformations. The shared trauma of learning that these kinds of crimes had been going on for so long and so close to home made people more aware of how important it is to be vigilant and responsible in their communities. People who had previously lived in relative isolation began to connect more, establishing support networks that transcended individual property boundaries. One interesting thing was how the story spread to other parts of the region and even further. For months after the trial, newspapers kept writing about the case, each adding its own take and analysis. Some looked at the criminal side of things, trying to figure out how people could do things like that. Others looked into social issues, looking at how being far away from other people and not having a legal system made it possible for crimes to happen without anyone noticing. Scholars from distant universities began to show interest in the case. Psychologists of the time, who didn't know as much as we do now, tried to put the Holloway brothers' behavior into groups. Sociologists analyzed the conditions that allowed the crimes to continue for so long. Historians documented the case as an example of the realities of life in rural America at the beginning of the 20th century. Pastor Garrett's sister wrote a short memoir about her brother and her search for answers in the winter of 1907. The article didn't go into detail about the crimes, but it did talk about the pastor's life before he went missing, how he affected the communities where he preached, and the lessons she had learned about faith and perseverance from her own painful experience. The book found a modest but dedicated audience, especially among religious communities. At the same time, Daniel Crawford was quietly working on his own way to heal. He stayed out of the public eye and turned down requests from reporters who wanted to talk to him about what happened. Instead, he used his energy to do physical work on the farm, which helped him calm his troubled mind by giving him a routine and making him tired. The nightmares started to happen less often, but they never went away completely. The state prison where the Holloway brothers were sentenced kept detailed records of how they acted. Reports said that they stayed very quiet and only talked to other prisoners or guards when they had to. They did what they were told without complaining, but they didn't show any signs of getting better or feeling sorry for what they did. In a lot of ways, they were just as mysterious in prison as they had been when they were free. In 1908, a young lawyer tried to reopen legal issues related to the case, which was an interesting turn of events. He said that the trial's technical aspects had broken some rules, that the defendant's lawyer had not done a good job, and that the jury could not have been truly impartial because the case had gotten so much media attention. His motions were finally turned down, but they sparked discussions about justice, due process, and how to strike a balance between the needs of the community and the rights of individuals. The memorial in the clearing near the church, on the other hand, became a permanent part of the area. People from faraway places came to pay their respects every now and then. They had read about the case and felt they had to. The pastor in the area kept the space clean by replacing flowers when they died and making sure that the wooden crosses were fixed when the weather damaged them. People in the community started to form a tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of the Holloway brothers' capture, people would go to the memorial and be silent for a moment. It wasn't a party to celebrate the capture. It was a time to remember the people who died and make a new promise to protect the weak. These yearly events became part of the community calendar, marking the passage of time and linking the present to the past. The shopkeeper, whose notebook was very important to the first investigations, eventually shut down his warehouse and moved to a bigger city. He felt a lot of guilt and always wondered if he could have done something sooner, or if his records could have saved lives if he had noticed the patterns earlier. This guilt, even though it wasn't based on real responsibility, showed how deeply the case affected even people who weren't directly involved. Samuel Porter, an experienced hunter who had helped catch the fugitives by knowing the mountains well, went back to his quiet life in the woods. He didn't talk about his part in the case very often. He liked to let other people tell the story. But sometimes, when young hunters asked him for help with tracking, he gave them useful tips that he had learned from his own experiences. The changes made to the systems that let counties talk to each other started to work. In the years after the Holloway case, a number of other crimes were solved more quickly because information was shared more effectively. People who were missing were found before bad things could happen. It was a good thing that came out of bad situations, proof that societies can learn from their mistakes and grow. A detailed census of the area was done in 1910 as part of a national effort, but it was done with extra care because of the case. The goal was to get better maps of populations, find communities that were cut off from the rest of the world, and make sure that everyone could get basic government services. It was an acknowledgement that extreme isolation engendered vulnerabilities that civilized society was duty-bound to rectify. As time went on, the stories about the Holloway brothers started to sound more and more like myths. Each time the story was told again, it added more details, sometimes making the historical truth clearer and sometimes making it less clear. Communities naturally turn real events into legends that serve social purposes beyond just recording facts. This is how they deal with trauma through stories. Local teachers started using the case as a teaching tool, but they changed it for different age groups. For adults, they talked about social responsibility and justice systems, and for kids, they taught them about the importance of community and caring for each other. It turned a tragedy into a chance to learn, making sure that the victims were not forgotten and that lessons were passed on to future generations. For years, no one lived on the property where the cabin used to be. As time went on, nature took back the land. Trees grew where buildings used to be, and plants covered the paths that led to the site. It became a place that people avoided, not because of official rules, but because the community agreed to do so. It was a place for quiet and thought. The years hung over the Georgia mountains like a veil, bringing with them the changes that always happen with time. As the seasons changed, springs turned into hot summers, golden autumns turned into white winters, and with each cycle, the story of the Holloway siblings became less of an open wound and more of an old scar in people's minds. The people who lived through the events began to get older, and their stories were passed down to younger generations through stories told on porches at night or around campfires on cold nights. Each telling held the weight of memory and the hope that knowing what happened in the past could help us understand what is happening now. The mountains, which were indifferent to their own beauty, stayed the same as they always had. The deep valleys, winding trails, and misty peaks stayed the same even after the terrible things that happened to people. Nature had its own rhythms, with cycles of growth and decline that went beyond the worries of the people who lived in these old lands for a short time. The memorial in the clearing, which had been well taken care of over the years, became as much a part of the landscape as the trees that surrounded it. Eventually, the wooden crosses were replaced with markers that would last longer, making sure that the names would last through the years. It was a quiet place where the wind whispered through the branches and the light that came through the leaves made patterns on the ground that looked like they were dancing. Daniel Crawford, the man whose brave escape changed everything, lived a long time in the area. He got married, had kids, and worked the land with hands that had learned how to make things instead of just getting by. He didn't talk about those days in the mountains very often, but people who knew him well could see in his eyes that some things stay with you forever. The case left a lasting mark on the community in small but important ways. People became more aware of how to help each other. They paid more attention to strangers who needed help, and they realized that being alone could be both a blessing and a curse. People learned that beauty and danger often go hand in hand, and that the same mountains that brought them peace could also hide danger. As stories are passed down from generation to generation, they inevitably mix with elements of fantasy. People forgot the details. People made up other stories to fill in the blanks, and the line between fact and fiction got harder to see. But maybe that didn't matter as much as the emotional core that stayed. The lessons about how weak people are and how important it is to be kind and watchful. The changes made to the systems for communication and legal presence kept getting better. What started as a response to a single tragedy slowly became a permanent structure that helped many people over the years. It showed that even in the worst times, things can happen that protect and serve future generations. People eventually forgot about the Holloway brothers. Their lives in prison are happening in secret, far from the mountains where they used to live. They became names in old records, and as the years went by, fewer and fewer people told their stories and figures. The victims were able to take center stage in the stories because they weren't there. The clearing where the memorial was became a place to think about not only those events, but also bigger questions about life, loss, justice, and memory. People came to the space dedicated to remembrance to find peace and quiet, think about the mysteries of life, and enjoy the natural beauty that surrounded it. The Appalachian Mountains, which have held many secrets for hundreds of years, still draw people who want to be alone and connect with something bigger than themselves. The story of the Holloway siblings was just one of many that had been told in that old landscape. This trip through one of the darkest times in that area reminds us that we should learn about and think about history, even when it is scary. Not to praise darkness, but to learn more about the light. Not to dwell on the terrible things that have happened, but to admire the strength of those who have survived and the bravery of those who want justice. Please think about subscribing to the channel if this story moved you in any way, made you think about people, community, or just took you on a journey through time and space. Every subscription helps us keep telling you stories that look into the most interesting and dark parts of being human. The mountains are still and timeless, keeping memories safe that will never be fully known. And maybe it's good that this is the case, that there is still some mystery. It reminds us of how much we don't know and how much we will never fully understand. Thank you for coming along on this trip with us. Until the next story.